Hello well-wishers and welcome to my channel Aspiring Minds. In today's video, we are going to discuss some of the important question answers from The Cookie Lady by Philip K. Dick. So grab your virtual seats and let's begin. The first type of questions that you could get in your exams are the logic based questions, and let us discuss each of these logic based questions. There are answers also available, so let's begin. Question 1. Babar's parents were concerned about his visits to the Cookie Lady because the reason is that they noticed that he always came back exhausted and thought something strange or unusual was happening during their visits. Question 2. Mrs. Drew's house was run down and isolated because the reason being it symbolizes her loneliness and her neglect, reflecting the absence of human connection and the impact of aging on her life. She had become old, so for her to maintain the house was difficult, and she also did not feel like doing it because she did not have anyone else for whom she should try to keep the house clean and well maintained. Question 3. The cookies provided by Mrs. Drew had a deeper significance than just a treat because the reason being that the cookies were the catalyst for Babar's visits. That is, it is the very reason which brings about a change in Babar's thinking, and the taste attracts him to come here. So it is his source of temporary rejuvenation for Mrs. Drew, because when Babar would visit, she would be very happy. She would for a brief moment be transported into another world of her own. So she also would put in a lot of efforts to prepare the cookies properly, and overall this represents the comfort and the connection that had developed between Mrs. Drew and Babar. Question 4. Mrs. Drew experienced a physical transformation during Babar's visits because the reason being that her rejuvenation, that change that would come in her of feeling young again, was a result of the emotional fulfillment, the emotional satisfaction she gained from his presence. Even though, or albeit it was temporary, still she would really like it. She would really cheer up on seeing Babar. It was her way of being able to connect with another human being. So that is why there would be a happy physical change that she would undergo. Question 5. The interaction between Babar and Mrs. Drew was essential to the story because the reason is that it highlighted the theme of human connection and the profound or the deep impact, even though it was a moment of brief companionship that was there between the two. But however, it helped the Cookie Lady more in curing her of the otherwise lonely and isolated state that she was in. Question 6. The story explores the theme of illusion versus reality through Mrs. Drew's transformation because, so here you will say that her change, her transformation, her rejuvenation occurs only when Babar is present, and it disappears once he leaves, revealing that the comfort that she would get of Babar's company was temporary and short-lived. Question 7. Mrs. Drew's plea for Babar to return again signifies the reason is that her desperation to maintain this temporary companionship with Babar, because it would give her joy, vitality, she would be full of energy, is experienced during his visits, which highlights the longing and the loneliness that she experienced, which is why she would always insist that Babar should come back again, and that is why she would put in special efforts to prepare those cookies for him. Question 8. Babar's initial indifference towards Mrs. Drew changes because the reason being that he becomes more aware of her emotional state and the importance of his visits, leading to a more conflicted attitude. Even though he is not liking it probably, but he still goes there because he is just getting manipulated, you could say, by Mrs. Drew. Question 9. The wind at the end of the story symbolizes, and this is a very important question, the answer being that the cold, harsh reality and the emptiness that returns after Mrs. Drew's temporary joy fades away emphasizes the theme of illusion versus reality, which is conveyed through the symbol of the wind at the end of the story. Question 10. The ending of the story implies that Mrs. Drew's transformation or rejuvenation was, the reason being, it was an illusion that depended on Bubber's presence, and once he left, the reality of her old age and loneliness would return. Now let's proceed to some short answer type questions. There are answers also which are there available for you, and I'll be explaining it as we take up each question one at a time. So let's begin. Let us have a look at the short answer type questions. Question 1. What does Bubber look forward to when visiting Mrs. Drew? The answer will be, of course, that he looks forward to the warm, freshly baked cookies which Mrs. Drew makes, and he eagerly eats these cookies and enjoys a glass of cold milk which she additionally offers along with these cookies. Question 2. How does Mrs. Drew initially react when Bubber arrives at her house? Answer. Mrs. Drew warmly welcomes Bubber, inviting him inside and offering him cookies and milk. She is happy to see him and eager to make him comfortable because she finally knows that there would be someone that could keep her company in her otherwise lonely, isolated condition. Question 3. What is Mrs. Drew's reaction when she learns that Bubber won't be coming back? The answer will be that Mrs. Drew is deeply distressed, disturbed and anxious when she learns that Bubber won't be returning. She feels a profound sense of loss and clings to the last few moments that she has with him. That is why she tells him or insists him to read, and he could read whatever he wanted, and then these would be how she wanted to spend her final moments with him. Question 4. How does Bubber's visits affect Mrs. Drew physically? The answer will be that during Bubber's visit, Mrs. Drew undergoes a physical transformation or change. She would become younger and more vibrant. Her appearance changes from an old and frail and weak lady to a youthful and full of energy kind of a person. Question 5. What does Mrs. Drew do after Bubber leaves for the final time? The answer will be that after Bubber leaves, Mrs. Drew excitedly reveals, or rather she revels, we could say, the word which also means enjoys, her newfound youth, enjoying her body and the vitality. She eagerly prepares for a new phase of her life. So you see how there is a sense of newness which is restored through Bubber's repeated visits. Let us now have a look at some of the long answer type questions which have been provided in your workbook. There are answers also which will help you to understand the approach you could take in answering your questions in the exam. Question 1. Describe the physical and emotional transformation Mrs. Drew undergoes during Bubber's visits. The answer will be that physically Mrs. Drew transforms from a frail old woman into a youthful and vibrant matron. Her wrinkles disappear, her hair darkens, and her body becomes full and youthful. Emotionally, she experiences a sense of joy and vitality during Bubber's visits, which helps her to be rid of the loneliness and gives her a temporary sense of happiness and purpose. Question 2. Analyze how the setting of Mrs. Drew's house contributes to the themes of the story or the development of the story further. The answer will be that Mrs. Drew's house is described as run down, overgrown, it is not maintained, which symbolizes her isolation and the neglect she feels. This dilapidated state of the house reflects her loneliness and the lack of connection in her life. The contrast between the shabby house and the warmth of the cookies highlights the theme of how she tries to seek comfort amidst desolation, amidst this loneliness, and through the warm cookies that she serves to the cookie lady. It is her way of trying to attract and keep the connection intact with Babur. Question 3. Explain the significance or the importance of the cookies in the story. The answer will be that the cookies symbolize the fleeting nature of Mrs. Drew's rejuvenation. They are the catalyst for Babur's visits and Mrs. Drew's temporary change or transformation. The cookies represent a brief escape from her loneliness and a means to connect with someone, in this case, Babur. Question 4. How does the interaction between Babur and Mrs. Drew reflect the theme of human connection? The answer will be that the interaction between Babur and Mrs. Drew reflects the theme of human connection by showing how even in brief moments of companionship, it can have a deep impact on the individuals. Babur's visits, though short, provide Mrs. Drew with that temporary joy and a sense of being valued, being recognized, which shows the power of human connection or human interaction in curing people of loneliness. That is why we go out to meet people, because we as human beings, we are social creatures, and if we do not have ways of connecting with other human beings, we are only going to feel more and more lonely. Question 5. What does Mrs. Drew's physical transformation reveal about her desires and emotions? The answer will be that her physical transformation reveals her deep longing for youth and vitality. Her rejuvenation during Babur's visits signifies her desires to reclaim what she has lost with age, and emotionally it shows her desperation to escape loneliness and find joy in her life. Question 6. Discuss the role of illusion versus reality in Mrs. Drew's transformation. The answer will be that the story explores the illusion versus reality theme through Mrs. Drew's transformation. Her rejuvenation is a temporary illusion that only lasts while Babur is present. Once he leaves, the reality of her old age returns. So this highlights the deceptive nature of temporary comfort and the limitations of superficial solutions to the deep-seated problems. Loneliness is something which she had to really look into and see how it could be cured. This was a very temporary solution, and indeed it was short-lived, as we see in the story. Question 7. How does Babur's attitude towards Mrs. Drew change throughout the story? The answer will be that initially Babur was ignorant and indifferent, and he would visit Mrs. Drew only for the cookies. However, as the story progresses, he becomes more aware of Mrs. Drew's emotional state and her request for companionship. His attitude shifts from casual to somewhat conflicted, especially when his parents also tell him that he is no longer going to visit the lady again. Question 8. What does the ending of the story suggest about the nature of Mrs. Drew's rejuvenation? So the ending of the story that suggests that Mrs. Drew's rejuvenation is fleeting and dependent only on Babur's presence. Once he leaves, her youth vanishes and she is left with the harsh reality of her old age. This indicates that her transformation was only an illusion, a temporary situation, and highlights the transient nature of comfort and joy that she would try to derive from external sources. When you have that cookie or that brownie, it will just give you a temporary moment of sugar rush. After that, you're going to feel guilty, or it is going to create health problems later on, only if it becomes a habit for you. Once or twice it is okay. So that's it from this video. I hope you liked it. Do hit the like button. Subscribe to my channel for more such future updates. Thank you for watching. Bye.